Mateusz Magiera, a Polish ethnologist at Jagiellonian University, studies alternative cultures and social rebellion in late 20th century Poland. His 2016 paper, Bieszczady, at the Source of Rebellion, uses 2015 fieldwork to examine the Bieszczady Mountains as a symbolic refuge for hippies, punks, and local zakopiers, outsiders. Through interviews and participant observation, he explores how these groups experienced and remember rebellion, freedom, and marginality, showing that their dissent often took the form of personal quests for authenticity and alternative living rather than overt politics. The work highlights how Bieszczady's mythic image as a land of freedom shaped countercultural identities and community life under communism. Although Magiera's broader academic footprint is modest, the study situates him within a tradition of young anthropologists documenting grassroots cultural phenomena at the intersection of place, memory, and post-communist history. In Polish cultural imagination, Bieszczady occupies a singular place. Popular myths of the Polish Wild West, a land of freedom, and a haven of untamed nature grew from the region's turbulent history and from literature and film that amplified those motifs. Reporting and memoir literature repeatedly foreground vagrants, outsiders, cowboys, and other freaks who descended on these mountains. Within that thicket of figures, the presence of hippies is especially striking, and alongside them, later, punks whose practices of dissent both echoed and transformed earlier modes of nonconformity. This article examines how those formations, hippies, punks, and local zakopiers, became vehicles for imagining and practicing rebellion. Following Palizny, I treat rebellion and alternativeness as forms of contestation that range from radical critique to everyday experiments in life conduct. Following Szysinski and Burster, I situate subculture and counterculture on a continuum of engagement with dominant norms. The question is less whether these actors changed the system than how they crafted niches, styles, and rituals that remade moral worlds in, and through, place. Research combined participant observation with unstructured interviews during 2 visits, April and July 2015. Respondents fell into 3 targeted groups: former punks, former hippies, and zakopiers, plus residents who observed or knew them. Prolonged time with interlocutors, at work, at home, and in pubs like Siekierazada in Cisna and Pioniska in Usterzyki Doln, proved key. Trust building allowed observation of social contexts in which narratives were produced. Memory is approached here, after Kanajowska, both as narrative and as an empirical document of lived reality. Interviewees locate the most visible wave of punk between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s, with earlier roots around the founding of KSU, 1978, and a proliferation of short-lived bands after Kołobrzeg, 1980. Many groups never played officially. What mattered was presence, on streets, in dress, in talk. Punks described their stance as a withdrawal from an overregulated social order where everything should be correct and in line. They rejected elaborate ideologies, equating ideology with new constraints, and insistence on living without externally imposed frames. Yet, as some acknowledged, that very insistence is an ideological position. Others looked back critically, naming it adolescent rebellion or fashion, but still recognized a genuine impulse to puncture provincial drabness and moralism. Respondents emphasized that the movement was more threatening in image than in fact. Authorities, residents, and clergy sometimes construed punks as pathological or sacrilegious. Security services reportedly infiltrated, monitored, and occasionally staged provocations. In practice, most local punk activity was less revolutionary than oppositional in tone, carving a cultural niche of refusal, style, and companionship rather than a program of systemic change. Accounts of 1970s hippies, more elusive in today's Bieszczady, revolve around efforts to escape urban control, establish rural communes, live closer to nature, and step outside the Polish People's Republic's apparatus. Many projects failed under hard conditions and police scrutiny, yet their stories proved generative. Hippies helped cast Bieszczady as a mythic refuge where freedom and authenticity remained possible, feeding a longer lineage of outsiders and wanderers who followed. In the post-1989 opening, the Rainbow family appeared in Bieszczady as a spiritual ecological successor to earlier countercultures rather than a foreign import. Rainbow's ethos, peace, ecological awareness, non-hierarchical community, voluntary simplicity, aligned with the mountain's image as a margin beyond institutional reach. The first Polish rainbow gathering at Tworylne in 1991, in an abandoned village on the San, became a regional landmark, an international, leaderless community practicing shared meals, song, and cooperation in nature. Local memory framed it as a peaceful burst of color amid uncertainty, less a protest than a palpable alternative. Longtime participant Judy described Rainbow not as a sect, commune, or festival, but a living experiment, a flexible synthesis of ecological consciousness, pacifism, and open-ended spirituality that welcomes people beyond labels. Gatherings self-organize without leaders, schedules, or money. Consensus circles orient communal life. A central kitchen circle enacts equality. Days are structured by work, conversation, music, and simple rituals at sunrise and dusk. In this practice, rebellion is ethical rather than spectacular, rejecting hierarchy and consumerism in favor of cooperation, care, and presence. Tworylne's timing and location mattered. Early in the post-communist transition, it brought together Poles and foreigners on extra-institutional terms, affinity, not authority. Accounts emphasize hundreds of participants building makeshift shelters, cooking collectively, singing, drumming, and deciding by consensus. Villagers and foresters observed a benign curiosity. For some, it signaled a cultural turning, from oppositional politics toward ecological spiritual coexistence. Concrete afterlives followed as several foreign participants returned to settle, seasonally or permanently, knitting everyday ties with locals. What began at Tworylne did not end there. Through the 1990s and 2000s, smaller national and local gatherings persisted, often relayed through friendships and seasonal return. Jawornik, near Komanksa, emerged as a favored site. Secluded forests and a rustic shelter nicknamed the Orchestra under the patronage of St. Nicholas served as a communal heart for music, talk, and ritual. Organization remained horizontal and agenda-free. Music bridged differences of nationality and worldview. Over time, the scene localized, less an event parachuting in than a cyclical rhythm woven into regional life. Rainbow in Bieszczady can be read as a ritualized renewal of a durable cultural myth, the land of eternal happiness, a protected zone where freedom, equality, and authenticity are lived rather than proclaimed. In Palisny's terms, it exemplifies a form of contestation that moves from confrontation to constructive alternativeness, not overthrowing institutions, but building moral worlds alongside them. Sisinski's insight that alternativeness is flickering, everyday, and relatively non-programmatic is borne out. The practices are modest yet persistent, ethical rather than doctrinal. As in pilgrimage or rite of passage, the journey to the mountains and weeks of collective life mark a crossing, out of structure and consumption, into simplicity and reciprocity. Wilderness functions both as boundary and metaphor. The camp becomes a temporary moral utopia, less escapism than rehearsal for other ways of being. Across memories of punks, hippies, and rainbow, Bieszczady emerges not just as a refuge from authority, but as a laboratory where rebellion is redefined. The arc runs from adolescent refusal and stylistic defiance, through experiments in communal subsistence, to ethical practices of cooperation and care. Rather than a single doctrine or heroic break, what persists is ritual repetition, gatherings, shared meals, songs, that quietly reaffirm the mountains as a landscape where freedom can still be tried on, inhabited, and handed down. The 1991 Rainbow Gathering in Tworylne, as described by Mateusz Magiera in Bieszczady, at the Source of Rebellion, 2016, holds major historical significance as a watershed event marking the rebirth of countercultural and communal ideals in post-communist Poland. Taking place just after the fall of the Soviet bloc, it represented one of the first large-scale, non-institutional international gatherings in Central and Eastern Europe, bringing together Polish and foreign participants in a shared experiment of peace, ecological living, and non-hierarchical coexistence. Set in the remote and symbolically charged Bieszczady Mountains, long mythologized as a land of freedom, the Tworylne gathering bridged Poland's own hippie legacy of the 1970s with a new, global wave of spiritual and ecological consciousness. For locals, the event signaled both cultural renewal and Poland's re-entry into the broader world after decades of isolation. Magiera interprets it not only as a historical moment of cultural contact but as a mythic continuation of Bieszczady's enduring role as a refuge for rebellion and alternative ways of life.